Well, we'll get started tonight. I'd like to welcome you all, and thank you for coming out tonight to the fourth event of the year of the George Washington Forum. The Washington Forum is a civic education initiative founded on the idea that students facing an increasingly globalized world need to understand what particularly characterizes and distinguishes the nation in which they live and the civilization from which it emerged. Directly allied with this mission to enhance civic education here at Ohio University is its effort to increase the campus's intellectual diversity. Tonight's lecture to the Forum is made possible primarily by a grant from Ohio University's 1804 Fund to fund a series of events on the Atlantic Foundations of America. A year ago, Dr. Jack Green of the Johns Hopkins University gave the first lecture sponsored by this particular grant. When he spoke to the Forum on the background of the nation's founding, and in particular on the debates in Britain about using force in response to colonial resistance. Last spring, the Forum also held a major conference on Making Democracy, Violence in the American Revolution, thanks to the generous sponsorship of the 1804 Fund, which will also fund 2 more speakers during this academic year, including tonight's. Tonight's lecturer, Dr. Jane Landers, comes to us from Vanderbilt University, where she's professor of history. She took a bachelor degree from the University of Miami and did her doctoral work at the University of Florida. She's written Black Society in Spanish Florida, which won a Best First Book Award from the Southern Historical Association, and the Atlantic World, A History, 1400 to 1888, in addition to editing at least 4 other books, and she's the author of dozens of articles. Her research has been supported by a number of prestigious awards, including ones from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Gilder Lehrman Center, and the Spanish government. Her latest book, about which she'll be talking tonight, is Atlantic Creoles in the Age of Revolutions, which has just come out from Harvard University Press. What distinguishes Dr. Landers' work from the previous lecturers is the people on whom she focuses. For Landers casts her eye on how peoples of African descent try to secure or assert their freedom during the Age of Revolution. What precisely it meant to be free or to have freedom in the Atlantic world during the late 18th or early 19th centuries is one of the important questions which her work raises. Is freedom an ahistorical thing, something we can recognize in all times and in all places? Or is it necessarily relational? These are questions especially pertinent for a nation that asserted its independence because its king was, in the words of the Declaration of Independence, unfit to be the ruler of a free people. We're lucky then to have as our guide Jane Landers here with us this evening, and I hope you'll join with me in welcoming her here to Ohio University.
I hope I have this aimed right, but thank you so much for the nice invitation. I'm so pleased to be here tonight to talk about this work, and I wanted to thank Mariana Dantes, Professor of History, and also the George Washington Forum and Ohio University for having me, and I'm glad to see people out on this wet, cold, rainy night. I'm flattered. As Robert mentioned, my talk today is drawn basically from the last book I wrote, Atlantic Creoles in the Age of Revolution, and I thought of the many characters that I've worked on, I would pick the one that might be the most connected to material you might also know best as U.S. citizens, so I picked a character who participates in the American Revolution. The book also discusses characters from the French Revolution, the Haitian Slave Revolt, fictive Indian nations and ephemeral states, I called them. So tonight, though, I'll concentrate on this one character. At the outset, I just want to say I wasn't really trained as an Atlantic historian, although this seminar focuses on Atlantic history. I was trained as a traditional Latin American historian. I had grown up in the Caribbean, and so I thought that was my niche, but I found as I studied it was a rather traditional kind of history, and I found myself gravitating away from it, and was lucky enough to find some wonderful documents at the University of Florida, which came from a collection of the Spanish government of Florida, 1784 to 1821, excuse me. And I just delved into those and had that wonderful trove to fish around in, which led me to the character I'm going to talk about tonight. But I also had the good fortune to connect to a wonderful group of historians and archaeologists who had collaborated on a lot of work, interdisciplinary work in Spanish Florida. And so that was how my career shifted from being a traditional historian, first of Brazil and later of the Spanish Caribbean, to doing what is now called Atlantic World History. And for those of you who may not have an acquaintance with that new field, it's basically the study of the linkages between the Americas, North and South, Europe and Africa, and all of the connections of trade and personnel and ideas and so on that circulate through the Atlantic world. So that's my shift, a little bit of bio before we jump into my story. And I must say that my dissertation director was dismayed to see the change in my career from a traditional Latin American historian to this sort of amorphous direction that he didn't recognize. I wasn't doing Mexico or Peru, which were the big fields in which I was supposed to be diving, and he warned me that I was going to be typecast as a local historian because I had decided to work in these Spanish Florida records, and that was a fate worse than death, apparently. But I followed my heart, and I ended up in these documents, and that's how I came to the story that I'm going to share with you tonight. So if I may, for a moment, I'm going to read something that sort of triggered me to think about these people that I'm writing about. There's a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood leads on to fortune. Omitted, all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and misery. On such a full sea are we now afloat, and we must take the current when it serves, or lose our ventures. You may recognize that from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, but it captured the people that I'm talking about as well, so that I tried to launch my first chapter with. Okay, my book employs the histories of diverse but connected cohort of Atlantic Creoles, and I need to define that maybe for the audience too that isn't in our jargon. These are persons that Ira Berlin, the famous historian of North America, describes as having been born in Africa or of African descent, but who had linguistic dexterity, cultural plasticity, and social agility. And all of these characters that I work on have all of that, and for that reason I found them so interesting. So I'm working on Atlantic Creoles and their descendants in the Age of Revolution. And the temporal framework of my study is approximately 1760 to 1850, which was, as you know, a period of radical social, economic, and political change across this Atlantic world that we're studying. The geographic focus, however, shifts from the better studied areas of northern Europe and northern North America to the southern mainland of North America and the Caribbean, of which it was an extension. If you remember, Florida sticking right down into the heart of the Caribbean, it circulates all these people through it in interesting ways, I think. So it was a multicultural arena, and Africans of many different ethnicities and a wide variety of indigenous nations, European powers such as Great Britain, France, and Spain, and eventually the new government of the U.S. all competed. In this conflict-ridden age, there were many opportunities for Atlantic Creoles to, quote, take the tide and alter life's course. Atlantic Creoles were embroiled in European and American revolutions, Indian wars, slave revolts, and the international efforts to abolish slavery, which I also consider a revolution. Because they were so often on the front of these contests, they were keenly attuned to shifting political currents. African and African-descended actors had access to a wide range of political information, both printed and oral, and they made reasoned and informed choices by which they sought to win and maintain liberty. They were often critical to the balance of power and soon became adept at interpreting political events and manipulating them when possible to achieve freedom. Their initiative and their agency, acts of resistance, flight, marronage, or running away to form private communities in the hinterlands, and their shifting relationships to various European, African, American or Native American powers shaped the course of international events as well as the local responses to them. There were black loyalists who followed the British standard in the American Revolution and the slave rebels who followed Toussaint and Saint-Domingue, and they've all become subjects of very important historical scholarship, particularly blacks in the American Revolution. There were a spate of books about the British loyalists of African descent. But some of the free and enslaved individuals involved in those events escaped those books and chose alternate paths that are equally interesting and less known. The Atlantic Creoles, about whom I write, fought variously for the King of Congo, the King of England, the King of France, the French Jacobins themselves, Muskogee and Seminole chiefs, and the King of Spain. Each shift of alliance required a rethinking and an evaluation of political platforms and programs and the possibilities for freedom that each offered. As they changed allegiances and identities, Atlantic Creoles also shaped the course of history, and their stories make more complex the traditional narrative and popular understanding of the Age of Revolutions. They demonstrate their active political and philosophical engagement in the most important events of their day. Africans and Spaniards actually shared many understandings of the proper relationships between ruler and subject. Loyal subjects generated reciprocal obligations from those they served, and both groups, Spanish and African, organized their societies as sets of interlocking corporate and family structures. These cultural cognates allowed even those Africans newly admitted into the Spanish polity to quickly learn Spanish legal and cultural norms. Once considered movable property in the English areas, the newly human and free were quick to pursue rights and privileges accorded them through membership in centuries-old Spanish legal, religious, and military corporations. And as they exercised their freedom, Atlantic Creoles repeatedly stressed their loyalty, their service, and their devotion to the Spanish king and the true faith in which they had to incorporate also the Catholic Church, and they expressed this in written documents. They also enacted these values in public ceremonies, and when they felt aggrieved, and some had reason to, Atlantic Creoles remonstrated, usually blaming any failure to honor promises and obligations on local officials, not on the distant king. That distant king, dependent as he often was on the services of free blacks to hold the far-flung empire and threatened frontiers, almost always supported the Atlantic Creoles. The enslaved Gambian, the English name Big Prince Whitten, lived through the misery of the Atlantic slave trade, the American, French, Haitian, and Latin American revolutions, Indian wars, and in Cuba, slave revolts and the fight for abolition. Whitten and others like him learned what it was like to be a slave in an English colony. They gradually became acculturated to the norms of Anglo slavery, learning plantation regimes, learning English, forming relationships with other Africans and their country-born slaves, and eventually starting families. And the 1770s were the peak years of the Carolina slave trade, and as more and more Africans poured into flourishing Carolina plantations, freedom must have seemed an ever more remote possibility for Whitten and fellow slaves. But then came the American Revolution. Its stirring rhetoric moved many who were actually enslaved to consider their own inalienable rights to liberty and to fight for it. South Carolina experienced some of the bloodiest fighting in the American Revolution, and enslaved families embroiled in that violence made political choices that might save or ruin them. As battles raged around them, they gained first-hand knowledge of the politics and racial dispositions of both the patriots and the loyalists. Rejecting both, the Whittens and hundreds like them risked all to escape across the international border to claim religious sanctuary in Spanish territory. In Florida, there they acquired legal personalities and rights and shed the dishonor of enslavement. Unable to tolerate such a threat to the chattel slave system, the new U.S. government pressured Spain to renounce the sanctuary policy in 1790, and thereafter, freedom seekers would have to find alternate routes. I did want to mention to you, but I'm afraid I'm going to run out of time, some of the other characters, so I think we'll run right to Juan Bautista Whitten. Each of these chapters in the book, I've searched for rhetoric that the persons themselves put into the documents to get a little bit of the voice of the African actors in the Age of Revolution, since it's harder to find it. Some of them are brief, but they had each chapter. And so Big Prince Whitten that you're going to hear about, this is from a petition he wrote at the end of his career in Cuba. For 26 years and 7 months, I have served with the most constant zeal and love in your majesty's urban company of color, and on all occasions I have pursued the rebels who have risen in this province. Juan Bautista Whitten, or Principe as he came to be known in Spanish records, was one of the millions of Africans who was swept into the Atlantic slave trade in the 18th century. Born somewhere on the coast of Gambia in about 1758, according to his own best estimates, Whitten was virtually the Forrest Gump of his day, present at almost all the major turning points in his history. Prince Whitten spent the first 15 years of his life in the Gambia, the next 10 years in South Carolina, another 35 in Spanish Florida, and the final years of his long life in Cuba. His successive and successful refashionings made Whitten a model Atlantic Creole. His remarkable career spanned the course of the American, French, Haitian, and Latin American revolutions and the eventual abolition of the Atlantic slave trade. And his story, as with the others, helps us to better understand how Africans in the Americas actually experienced and interpreted the Age of Revolutions and the failed promises of that era. We do not know what his African name was or how he came to be enslaved, but in the 1770s, Whitten survived the horrors of the Middle Passage to disembark at Charleston, South Carolina. The physician charged with visiting the incoming ships and reporting on the health of the enslaved aboard claimed that while crossing the Atlantic, some of the traders threw overboard as many as 2/3 of their captives. He described the, quote, filth, putrid air, putrid dysenteries on the ship and added, "It's a wonder any escape with life." Prince was one of the strong or lucky who did. Even before the young African descended the gangplank to the required quarantine at the pest house at Sullivan's Island in Charleston Harbor, he would have realized that many of his countrymen had preceded him across the Atlantic. Many of their bodies littered the marshes opposite Charleston. Prince might have seen them as the ship approached the harbor. He might also have heard the, quote, plaintive African songs in cadence with the oars as black canoemen rowed passengers and goods from ocean-going vessels to shore. Or maybe he saw the many Negro boats from which black fishermen hauled in blackfish and trout for sale in the city. No other city in British North America imported more enslaved Africans than Charleston, leading a Swiss visitor in 1737 to remark that South Carolina was like a Negro country. By 1770, the colony was home to 80,000 persons of African descent, who formed roughly 60% of the population, and a majority of those were from Upper Guinea, which is where Prince was from. At the house of one of the many slave trading firms in the city, Whitten would have stood among other African men, women, and children to be examined by prospective buyers. Peter Whitten, a justice of the peace for Charlestown District and collector of the poor tax for St. John's Parish, Berkeley County, purchased our protagonist to work on his inland plantation about 40 miles from Charleston. Whitten could not have been much more than about 15 years of age at the time and a man-boy in the parlance of the trade, but his new owner named him Big Prince. Even at that young age, he must have been an imposing figure, and 10 years later, when I find him in the Spanish documents, he's described as 6 foot and brawny. As Prince walked through the streets of Charleston with the man who had just bought him, the African character of the place would have been as obvious to him as it was to the city's European visitors. An anonymous English traveler reported that in 1774, Charleston was home to 30,000, quote, black Negro slaves and only 9,000 to 10,000 white inhabitants. The young African would have seen black stevedores and sailors, coachmen, workmen, artisans of every kind, and black women with foodstuffs and crafts arrayed around them for sale at Charleston's lower market. The chance of street hucksters selling oysters, shrimp, fruits, vegetables, baked goods, and other edibles from woven grass baskets balanced on heads might have reminded him of his own home. And as runaway notices state, many of these black artisans and entrepreneurs would have borne familiar scarification patterns. Some may have displayed filed teeth. Heading down Bay Street, Prince and his new owner would have boarded one of the riverboats that carried passengers and supplies up the Cooper River towards Whitten's inland plantation. Slave crews dominated the river, and coastal traffic of South Carolina and many of the patroons or pilots of these vessels were also black. One Camden merchant who traveled from Charleston up the Cooper River found only Negroes on board. Slaves from the upriver plantations also traveled the Cooper in canoes and petty-augers, stopping to trade or visit with friends and relatives on neighboring plantations, where it was not uncommon for them to share food, drink, and sometimes music. The mobility, independence, and geopolitical awareness of the area's black boatmen created communal capital from which other members of the enslaved community could benefit. As Prince traveled inland, he was probably already acquiring information about his future destination and the politics of the new country he had entered. Prince's river journey up the Cooper River ended at Monk's Corner, an old trading post about 26 miles from Charleston that boasted several taverns and stores where area planters socialized and exchanged information. From the way station at Monk's Corner, a road ran northward to the ferry on the Santee River and on to the nearest town of Camden, and the Whitten plantation lay along this important corridor, as did the Canty plantation up the road where Prince would find a wife. The region he was entering was still a frontier. Catawba Indians allied to the British and Cherokees, whose land the British would eventually take, still formed part of the turbulent multiracial environment. The new town of Camden had only been established in 1768, and 5 years later, jurors were still complaining about the wolves and tigers and bears and the idle and disorderly vagrants constantly hunting in the woods and destroying deer for their hides. But Charleston's elites saw profits to be made in that wilderness, and they sent large numbers of newly arrived Africans in there to make it. And Prince was one. So despite constant worries about escape and rebellion, planters continued to import slaves, and by the 1770s, Africans formed at least 90% of the population of this parish. Prince thus entered a region that was largely African and famed for insurrection. Local slaves could tell tales of flight and resistance, of great imperial conflicts, Indian wars, and of alternate forms of government and freedom to the south. Many were running to St. Augustine, where I was going to encounter them. Even as Prince was adjusting to life on the Whitten plantation, however, Atlantic politics were shaping his destiny. In the summer of 1775, Charleston's leading figures expressed indignation over the closing of Boston's port and created a council of safety with the slave trader Henry Lawrence as president, and they elected delegates to attend the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia to be held the following September. At the same time, the grand jury of Camden, our little frontier town, on which sat several members of the numerous Canty family, issued a proclamation protesting taxation without representation and remarking on their birthrights as freemen. And whereas we choose to die freemen, and whereas we rather choose to die freemen than live slaves, bound by laws in the formation of which we have no participation, they resolved to maintain our constitutional rights at the hazard of our lives and fortunes. And the irony of the refusal to live slaves seems to have escaped these authors, but such fiery rhetoric would have resonated with attentive slaves through the region. As one historian noted, the Southern slaveholders' dilemma was, quote, to prevent their slaves from imbibing the heady notions of liberty and equality, which had become their own rallying cry against Britain. It was a losing proposition. Charleston merchant Josiah Smith, Jr. wrote, "Our province at present is in a ticklish situation on account of our numerous domestics who have been deluded by some villainous persons into the notion of being all set free." On the imminent revival of the new royal governor, Lord William Campbell, Smith added that the rumor of British emancipation is the common talk throughout the province and has occasioned impertinent behavior in many slaves. And contemporaries throughout the colonies were well aware that the slave telegraph communicated such important political news rapidly. After a report that 20,000 Negroes from South Carolina and Georgia would surely desert to the British to become free, John Adams wrote in his diary, quote, "The Negroes have a wonderful art of communicating intelligence among themselves. It will run several hundred of miles in a week or fortnight." worried whites in Charleston hastily raised 3 companies of militias to patrol the street and, quote, keep those mistaken creatures in awe. But even the presence of armed mounted patrols did not calm the panic in Charleston. That August, jurors charged the free black harbor pilot Thomas Jeremiah with conspiring with the British to incite slave insurrection. Governor Campbell objected to the lack of evidence against Jeremiah and described him as a free Negro of considerable property, one of the most valuable and useful men in his way in this province. And despite the governor's protests, jurors sentenced the black pilot to death, and he was hung and burned to ashes in the public square. Jeremiah died protesting his innocence, and an assembled crowd that included many people of color heard the doomed man warn that God's judgment would one day overtake them for shedding his innocent blood. Violence against Carolina slaves had by this time become almost commonplace, and the South Carolina Gazette reporting frequent acts of public terror such as castration, gibbeting, burning alive, cropping ears, and decapitation. Without shame, owners advertised for the heads of their runaways, and occasionally the newspaper also reported the slaves' revenge for their mistreatment. Planter fears of South Carolina's slave majority eventually trumped their loyalty to Britain, and in December 1775, South Carolina's reluctant revolutionaries became the first colonists to declare their independence. On July 4th, 1776, the Second Continental Congress followed suit, and war began in the North. During this tumultuous period, Prince met a woman named Judy, who was a slave on the nearby Canty plantation, and by 1777, the couple had formed what would be a lifetime bond. Judy was later described in a runaway ad as, quote, smart, active wench, and was country-born, meaning this side of the Atlantic. Her language skills and knowledge of the local must have assisted Prince's rapid cultural adaptation. In 1778, Judy and Prince had their first son, whom they named Glasgow, and the following year their daughter Polly was born. When the children were still infants, the chaos of the American Revolution engulfed Carolina and this family. The British launched their southern campaign in Georgia in late 1778, and from Georgia they moved northward to South Carolina. Sir Henry Clinton, commander of Britain's southern campaign, repeated Lord Dunmore's earlier offer to free slaves who would serve the British military. The overwhelming response led loyalists to enact strict measures to control the, quote, banditis of Negroes who flocked to the conquerors. But when Clinton's large fleet sailed into Charleston Harbor with 14,000 British troops on board the next year, black observers must have thought liberation was at hand. Most would be disappointed. A hard siege ensued before the patriot defenders of Charleston finally surrendered to British occupation on May 12, 1780. And with that victory, the British began to establish garrisons throughout the interior. General Charles Cornwallis established a large force of 2,500 troops through St. John's Parish and marched right past the Whitten and Canty plantations to establish his headquarters at Camden that we talked about earlier. Cornwallis and Bloody Tarleton, infamous for killing surrendered patriots, held Camden for almost a year. You may have seen the Mel Gibson movie, The Patriot. This takes place here. It's not very accurate. In response, local men of substance, such as Francis Marion from nearby Monk's Corner, became patriot guerrillas. The locals' deep knowledge of the swampy and wooded terrain made them formidable opponents of even the best-trained British regulars, and Marion became known as the Swamp Fox, Mel Gibson. Soon the Loyalists and Patriot forces were fighting, quote, a bloody war without quarter all around the Whitten and Canty plantations in what one scholar called South Carolina's uncivil war. Commanders on both sides seemed horrified by the level of barbarity that grew out of this internecine warfare. Patriot General Nathaniel Greene wrote, "The Whigs and Tories pursue one another with the most relentless fury, killing and destroying each other wherever they meet. The great bodies of militia that have been in service this year employed against the enemy and in quelling the Tories have almost laid waste the country." Greene's aide wrote, "I envy everything I see except the poor unhappy blacks, who to the disgrace of human nature are subject to every species of oppression, while we are contending for the rights and liberties of mankind." Some of the British officers were equally dismayed. British General Charles O'Hara wrote that the region near Camden was, quote, beyond description wretched. Every misery which the bloodiest, cruel war ever produced we have constantly before us. And before leaving the area, the Loyalist Rangers waged a scorched earth policy, burning the towns of Camden in 96 and leaving smoldering ruins where once stood mills, plantations, stores, all in ashes. Prince Whitten and his family lived through the worst of these cruelties, and during the Loyalist occupation of the Carolina interior, a British colonel camped at Mount Hope, one of the Canty plantations. After many months of hard fighting, in August 1781, the Patriots under Francis Marion retook that plantation, and so the slaves on those plantations were able to see both the Patriots and the Loyalists in action. 18 months of terrible fighting in St. John's Parish disrupted agriculture as armies on both sides commandeered slaves and precious food supplies. People went hungry, and slaves got the least to eat. Refugees from the violence flooded into Charleston, where they had traded a modicum of safety for miserable living conditions in squalid camps. And as if the fighting and the famine had not done enough damage, smallpox arrived in Carolina in the fall of 1779. And it hit the Whitten household. Little Polly Whitten was later described as, quote, gently pitted with the pox, but at least she survived. Many slaves who had taken advantage of the chaos to desert their plantations and run for British camps were not so lucky. Great numbers of infected slaves died in makeshift British camps or were left to die in agony along the roadsides as they attempted to flee southward with the British. While the British occupied Charleston from 1781 to 1782, however, they recruited, armed, and uniformed approximately 700 ex-slaves. The general in charge organized some of the black recruits into a cavalry of black dragoons that patrolled the area north of Charleston and down the Cooper River. Patriots were dismayed by the sight of still enslaved blacks armed and on these patrols, but the blacks themselves might have regarded this as freedom materialized. Some loyalists, such as Lord Dunmore, pressed for an even larger force to be constructed, but most British officials demurred, fearing the long-term consequences of arming so many blacks. The Whittens and the other slaves in the area had firsthand knowledge of the political propositions and the racial dispositions of both Patriots and Loyalists, and most scholars agree that the blacks served the Loyalists in larger numbers. Not all went willingly. Some were commandeered for work, some were taken as booty. At any rate, tremendous disruption and people moving through the countryside. Loyalist cavalry forces led by one Colonel William Young actually took charge of Prince and his family, and we don't know exactly how that came to be. One report said that he was commandeered as spoils of war. It's also possible that he may have joined this force voluntarily, knowing the Loyalists offered him a better deal than the Patriots. But Colonel Young moved the family ever southward until finally they end up basically at the St. Mary's River, the division line between Georgia and Florida. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris ended the American Revolution and returned Florida to Spain, and dejected Loyalist planters packed their belongings to evacuate to the Bahamas, Nova Scotia, and other still English locales. But hundreds of slaves seized the moment and ran away rather than face unknown places and climes and forced separation from their loved ones. Some ran to the Seminole hinterlands, where I tracked some, and some decided to remain in Spanish Florida. What about the Whittens? Somehow in 1785, Prince, Judy, Polly, and Glasgow had become a slave of a Georgia planter right on the St. Mary's River. It was a body of water only 7 miles wide and less at some points, and it was across that river you faced another country and a chance for a different life. Prince may have learned from others about Florida's religious sanctuary policy. These might have been tales told as Spanish traders, sailors, and officials frequented St. Mary's taverns and stores. And one cold Sunday morning in December of 1786, a year and a half after being enslaved by the Georgia planter, and after at least 3 failed attempts, the Whittens made their way across the dark water of the St. Mary's into Spanish Florida. Attempting to recover them, the planter Weed placed runaway ads, which described Prince as 6 feet high, strong-built and brawny, a carpenter by trade, 30 years of age, and talkative. His wife Judy, a smart, active wench, also about 30 or upward and country-born, 5'7" or 8 inches high. Children Glasgow, about 8 years of age, a well-looking boy of open countenance and obliging disposition. And Polly, 6 years old, lively eyes and gently pitted with the pox. And this little ad is what captured me and shifted my whole career because it made such a nice picture of this family. Weeds' notice stated he believed Prince had, quote, carried them off with him to Florida to avoid a separation from his family, to which he's much attached. And that's exactly what Prince did. In crossing the newly established international border of the St. Mary's River, the Whittons finally found freedom, but they did not escape danger. Because Spanish Florida had the misfortune to be the southern desire of the new United States of America, a nation as ambitious as it is industrious, to quote one Spanish official, and because it had an important Atlantic port in St. Augustine on the northern rim of the Caribbean and the southern fringe of the Anglo world, the Whitton family would continue to be swept up in the dramatic political and military events that swirled around them. The new governor, in receiving them, doubted actually the people's religious motivation, charging that not one of them has manifested once here the least inclination to be instructed and converted to our holy faith. But he was forced to honor the crown's century-old offer to shelter any slave of the Protestants who sought the true faith. It was the governor's appraisal that the fugitives simply sought liberty or escape from a cruel master, and he may have been correct. But he was bound to honor the crown's offer to shelter any slaves of the Protestant English, and that's how the Whittons finally got safety in Spanish Florida. Prince was among 250 fugitive slaves who came to be accepted by the Spanish government in St. Augustine, and their records appear in the notary office there. Unfortunately, only the males were registered, and for some time, I thought that the family had been separated and we had lost Judy, Polly, and Glasgow along the way. But later I came to understand that they had converted to Catholicism, and at that point, at baptism, you take new names. And so Judy becomes Maria Francisca. Also, so does Polly become Maria Francisca. And Glasgow becomes Francisco. So I finally found them, and they were united the whole time. I was happy to find. So. Aided by their early contacts and patrons, by their rapid adoption of Catholicism, by their respectable behavior, and by their valuable military and occupational skills, refugees from Anglo slavery like the Whittons became important members of the free black community in Spanish Florida. They worked hard, they defended their community when called upon, and they made free lives for themselves, acquiring property and intermarrying with other successful runaways. The Whittons and their fellow freedmen proved to be a valuable source of skilled labor and military reserves for the Spanish community. And despite attempts by some of their former owners to recover their chattel through legal channels, the once dubious governor consistently supported the blacks' rights to liberty. So legally protected and free at last, Prince Whitton began to establish himself in Spanish Florida. And over the course of the next 35 years, Prince and Judy and Glasgow and Polly transformed themselves from fugitive slaves into loyal Spanish subjects. The instant Prince and his family had crossed the St. Mary's River, that Spanish Jordan, and reached the other shore, they were born again. They were made human, acquiring personhood and autonomy. They took on new names, new legal personalities, and new corporate identities, and began to enjoy precious liberties long denied them. One was simple geographic mobility. They could go where they would. Choice was another. They could choose what work they would do, where they would live, and whom they would marry. They could control their persons, their property, and even others. The Whittons actually acquire a slave of their own. They gained access and voice, learning quickly how to make claims on a legal system that recognized and protected them. They also learned how to work the social and religious systems that incorporated them. And the Whittons' successive and successful refashionings made them model Atlantic Creoles. I see I'm going a little bit long here, so I'm going to shift to the end, and so we'll still have some time. We're not? I can keep going? Okay, everybody's going like this. All right. I will say that I'll add a little bit more then that might be significant. Religious transformation was the key to the Whitens' new liberties, for it was upon that claim to want conversion that all their other rights rested. It's difficult to overestimate the significance of the Roman Catholic Church as a vehicle for African assimilation and social acceptance and advancement in Spanish communities. In a sense, it was the one true equalizer, for within the church all were, quote, brothers in Christ. The Catholic Church had incorporated Africans centuries before Spain's expansion into the Americas, and although the Catholic evangelization effort among Africans in the Americas may have appeared minimal compared to that of the Native Americans, the Catholic Church did welcome and encourage black converts. And it's not surprising that newly freed men and women, conditioned to a chattel slave system that limited their access to Protestant church membership, would seize the opportunity to have themselves and their children baptized in St. Augustine's Church. The corporate nature of the church had important cultural implications for both free and enslaved Africans. It offered them affiliation, brotherhood, protection, and status. Prince and Judy joined other refugees in seeking church membership for their children, even before officially registering with government authorities. At about age 9, Glasgow became Francisco Domingo Mariano Whitten, and 7-year-old Polly became Maria Rafaela Whitten. And done properly, it took more time to convert the adults who had to be baptized only after they passed a priest's examination on the tenets of the church. And language impediments must have surely slowed that process. But 4 years after the baptisms of their children, Prince and Judy also entered the Catholic Church, taking the baptismal names Juan Bautista Whitten, Maria Rafaela Canty. It has several functions being baptized. I'm going to now start to condense this a little bit. One of the most important was gaining these godparents that you gain at baptism. And so the godparents for Prince Whitten were very important figures in the community. A prominent Spaniard, Don Manuel Fernandez Bendicho, was their next-door neighbor, served as Prince and Judy's godfather at the baptism. And also later he would stand with them when they got married. This was the beginning of the family's social ascent. And the new Catholics, Prince and Judy, soon became among the most popular godparents in the black community of St. Augustine. Prince was godfather to 23 individuals, and Judy served as godmother for 31 persons. Later, Polly and Glasgow would also be popular godparents. Acquiring as many dependents as they did enhanced the Whitten status in the Catholic community and reinforced their respectability. The other advantage of joining the Catholic Church was that Domingo, as a young boy, was able to attend the Catholic school there. All the children, black and white, who were of free status, attended the school together and became part of a corporate community, required to serve at the funerals of their other classmates. They processed together, they learned the same curriculum together, and this was a very important tool, again, of social ascent for the family, because Prince never learned to write, Judy neither, and Domingo was the key to everybody's literate communication. He does learn to write and later on files many documents on behalf of his family. All right, well, the other thing that's very important to Prince's ascent and that of his family is that he becomes an important military figure. He's elected to become the sergeant of the Free Black Militia during a Jacobin invasion of Spanish Florida. They were going to try to liberate the Spanish Florida from the monarchy. He serves in his first series of battles in 1794, and he's in every other major event thereafter. In a covert operation the U.S. Marines run in St. Augustine in 1812 against pirates, against failed revolutionaries and filibusters from all over the Caribbean. Prince is at every one of these as the elected head of the Free Black Militia, which also gives him additional status, another sort of dependence group under his command, his own militia. And they will stay together all the way to the end of the Spanish government in 1821, when the U.S. acquires Florida through sort of a command purchase. And the Spanish community and the Free Black community and some of the Indians under the Spanish sway also moved to Cuba, including Prince Whitten. Unfortunately, his family did not go with him, and so I still have to find out what happened to them under the American regime. But Prince felt it was his duty to take his command to Cuba and be the one to lead them to their new homes in Havana. And I have tracked many of his community, his militia groups, and their children into Havana and Matanzas, Cuba. They also join militia units there. They live in the same neighborhoods together. They continue to baptize or serve as godparents for each other's children. And there's a certain amount of cohesion of this community, even in yet another exile that they face together. So this is one of the groups that I study, but some of these people that will interact with Prince's big unit of free black militia are Seminole Indians who occupied the interior of Spanish Florida. They all work in units together against the advance of the U.S. government that's bound to determine to return everybody to slavery and to take the Seminole lands. So out of their joint interests, they all work together to keep out the Americans. And they don't, of course, but they do hold the tide long enough to figure out what they're going to do next. And the next move is to Havana, where free blacks had already been enjoying privilege and power and property and status under the Spanish regime in Havana since it was established, really. They'd been dependent upon free black militia. All this, unfortunately, comes to some rather sad end when Saint-Domingue blows up. The slave revolt in Saint-Domingue means that sugar is ruined in Haiti. It means that sugar takes off in Cuba, and that means more and more African slaves are introduced into Cuba. That means the decline of the free black population in Cuba. That means repression in Cuba, and that means eventually, after a major slave revolt in Cuba, the dispersal once again of many of the free blacks that I've been tracking. Some of them are just who don't have patrons, like Prince would have been okay, but others that didn't have so many connections were put on boats and shipped to anywhere. So I've seen them go to Jamaica, Brazil, Mexico, Africa, Fernando Po in Africa. And they're dispersed again, and a small group come back to the United States in the 1840s, imagine, to Florida. I can't imagine why, except that they still had potentially some family and kinship and corporate connections there, even among the white community in Spanish Florida. And some people that study the territorial period of Florida from 1821 on find that the race relations and the family connections that pre-existed continue even as new incoming Anglos try to put in a two-caste system, a slave-free system. That intermediate system still prevails in Spanish cities like St. Augustine and Pensacola. In the interior around, which will become the new plantation area around Tallahassee, you'll see the implementation of a very harsh racial system, such as the newcomers had found in Georgia and other parts of the South. So I think I've gone a little bit long, but maybe this will leave us a little bit of time for questions and answers, which I would welcome. Thank you. Was I talking too fast? I'm sorry? It's very interesting. In St. Augustine, it's not a big place, if any of you have been there. I have a census from 1793 that tells me exactly where everybody lived, and on one side of his house, on one side of the Witten's house is Don Manuel Bendicho, and on the other side of him of the family lives Don Juan Leslie, who was a Scottish trader for the Panton Leslie and Company, a major Indian trader and merchant in the Bahamas, who also had a black consort and free black children. And so he has on either side of the family two very, very important, prominent figures. And out of that proximity, I believe, they established the relationship. And Bendicho, it's to Bendicho's enhancement also a status to bring people to the church. And so I think that's how that happens. But they were very well connected and respected in a small community, but this would have been true of any Spanish Caribbean place of the time. As I said, when sugar takes off, you don't want to be anywhere there's sugar if you're an African, because it's going to be bad times. So it gets worse in Cuba. I can't see, because of the lights, if there's any other hands. Well, I see one.
You mentioned that Prince once upon a joke before he had slaves. Is that what you said?
He has one slave, yes.
And so how does that, I guess, affect Prince's view of liberty, and how does that work within Florida? I guess different.
Well, it is a very intriguing question, and of course, there's not a narrative tradition or an autobiographical tradition in the Spanish records, such as you sometimes get in the Anglo records, a sort of produced narrative by the abolitionist groups, like Olado Equiano's narrative and others, Those are pretty packaged kind of things, and you get some ideas of how they felt when and where. But there's nothing like that in the Spanish records, which you have are petitions, which sometimes tell this is what I did and this is what I want. But nobody wrote down, and this is how I feel about slavery, and this, But just to say that slavery was an international system, and that in Africa, people were enslaved by others as well. You don't enslave your own group. You enslave somebody else. And so it's a legal system. It's not a racial system. And I hope that they were kind masters. I believe they were. They also took in a free young girl who may have been, they call her an agregada. That's just somebody added to your household. And she may have been an orphan, I don't know. But Judy was training her as a domestic and in sort of an apprenticeship program. And so in their household, they had a slave for whom they served as godparents of her child as well. So it does, in the Spanish world, your slave is an extension of your family in many cases, and I think that's probably the system that they were using, since I see them serving as the godparent for just one young woman who was enslaved in their property. And then this other agregada is a young free girl of color who is being trained by Judy to take on a role as a domestic.
Yeah, you mentioned the records. I was wondering if you had to go to Spain for any of the Spanish side of the records.
Yes, I mean, most of these records are in Spain. The Archivo General de Indias is the main repository for all the colonies. So if you want to study the Philippines, or you want to study Florida, or you want to study Mexico, you go to Spain. But I've also worked in Cuba. I worked a lot in the Spanish Florida records that were already acquired, some in Mexico, because the tax base for Florida was Puebla, Mexico. The judicial system, Spanish is a very complex administrative system, but the Court of Appeals is in Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. The military and the church for Florida are in Havana, Cuba. The records all have to go back to Spain, so you really have to work all of those things. And then so much commerce and intercourse with merchants and so on is through Charleston and Savannah and Baltimore and Philadelphia, which was actually the diplomatic place where ministers of Spain sent their diplomats, was to Philadelphia. So there's a lot of connections to Philadelphia as well. So it's pretty dispersed. Yes, thank goodness. They kept them like in quintuplet, and you can find drafts of 4 things before you find the original. So in Florida, I could get the sort of local version. In Spain, I could get the mucky-muck version. Putting all that together, you get a better picture. Yes, sir.
A friend of mine was one of the historians who studied the Black Loyalists of Nova Scotia.
Mm-hmm.
But he told me that in interviewing their descendants in the 1970s, people who were still living on the wretched lands that they ultimately then assigned, he would go into a shack-like house, or he would go into a mobile home, and on the walls he would invariably find photolithographs of Elizabeth II and Philip, and that the people valued the monarchs as descendants of George III, and were thoroughly convinced that only matters of properly represented to George III. They were gotten the free lands they deserved. Local officials had done them in. And I wondered if, for example, in the Cuba, where the status of free blacks declined, is there any feeling that, well, the Spanish kings didn't want this, the monarchs didn't want this, it was local officials, any attempt at deputations to Madrid of the kind that the black loyalists sent to London from Nova Scotia?
These are very similar tales, and the irony of this book ends up that most of the people that I'm writing about chose monarchy over democracy, because what did it have to offer them? It was, So the stories are similar, and yes, they always blame the locals versus the benevolent king who's so distant. There were some deputations of people from Cuba. A good book has been written about the copper miners of El Cobre near Santiago, Cuba, and they had really acquired sort of freedom by just people leaving them there, and they had lived as free for a long time until the Spanish try to make the copper work again and try to re-enslave them, and they won't have it. They send a delegation to Spain, and they really are allowed to have their freedom. And there are examples of that, yes, and they were constantly petitioning to the Spanish king, and any time an official got a petition, they had to route it through channels. So I have formerly enslaved, now free black women writing directly to the King of Spain. It took 9 years for her case to finally get sorted through, but it had to keep going back and forth. So they're very much feeling a relationship to someone they've never seen. Jess.
At the beginning of this lecture, you laid out a definition of these Creole Atlantic wanderers. And I was just wondering, because they are again minorities, I'm wondering if you have any sense of why Prince Whitman and Judy and these other characters you found in the book, what do they share in common that makes it possible for them, either individually, to take on this risk? You talk quite a bit about how risky it is to try and game the system and how many people probably fail along the way.
Yeah.
I just wondered if you could talk maybe a little bit about what distinguishes them from the great majority who don't end up being able to travel all over the world and fight Seminole enemies and then enter Cuba.
I know, I'm writing The Great Black Men of History, I guess, this semester. It actually, I don't really know, that's why I chose that quote from Julius Caesar. They took the tide, they took the risks, and they ran with it. Many others didn't, and so I don't find their stories, actually. So I recognize that these are the exceptional few who rise, and I find lots of documents on them and so on. And it tends to be mostly men that I write about, unfortunately, because it's a military political tale, but I try to say as much as I can about their wives and family members as well. And women could generate records and own property and testify in courts and all of that in the Spanish system, so I do get quite a bit of that, and I've published some things on women specifically to make that point. Even children could be interviewed as long as they understood and were Catholic. So I really don't know what makes them so exceptional. It's some inner fortitude, I suppose, and an ability to see opportunity and jump on it, because the Whitmans tried 4 times before they finally made it across that water. That means they were recaptured, maybe punished, I don't know, because that was in the Anglo records that I haven't seen. But I really started this research a long time ago when I was a graduate school student with a case I found of a much earlier case of an African man who goes to South Carolina when it's just being founded, and he joins the Yamasee Indian Revolt, and all of them come to Florida. And he's literate. He was a Mandingo, I believe, so he was probably trained in the Quranic school, because he has several languages, and writes directly to the King of Spain saying, this is what I did for you, and now I want X, Y, and Z. When he doesn't hear from the king, he decides to become a corsair so that he can go to Old Spain and then see this king that won't answer him and see him in person. And he felt that he could really do that. So our view of African American slavery and African American history, as it's taught, is often cotton fields, sugar cane fields, whatever, everybody in a row, not having any political roles. And I realize these are urban people that I'm talking about, as you work on also, but urban areas can provide you a lens that may not be the whole, but it's an interesting lens. And these people, have to figure it out pretty quickly or else they can sink. Thank you. Yes?
One of the great questions, within U.S. history and history of African Americans is the degree of cultural retention, right, especially with Africa, within the slave quarters and elsewhere. The people that you look at are so, as you described them earlier, culturally sort of malleable and moving around. Do you see signs of this continued linkage back to Africa?
I would like to, but it's in their best interest to be as Catholic and as Spanish as they can be. I worked on a museum exhibit on this free black town that I worked on that the man was writing to Spain about. If any of you go to St. Augustine, it's called Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose, and it's now a National Historic Landmark, first free black town in the United States in 1738. But I work with archaeologists, and sometimes in the archaeological record you can find this, but usually the people that I'm working on are trying so hard to fit that they aren't practicing Islam anymore, and they're not doing, santeria or candomblé in their houses. They're trying to be pretty much uniform. But the other people, I am very interested in that, and I do find elements of these religious exchanges from Africa back and forth, and even among the Indians of the Southeast. I have a wonderful Indian spy for the Spanish who goes to Charleston, and when he comes back to make his report, the governor wants to send him to Havana to make the report, the governor of Florida. And he says, I can't go. I've made a vow to Oshun, which is the goddess of childbirth, for a good birth for my wife, and I can't, and the governor says, he can't go. So when the baby was born, I guess he went and made his report. But here's an Indian of the Southeast, a Creek Indian, adopting Oshun as his patron saint of the god of the good childbirth for his wife. So these things circulate, but they don't often get written about. Once in a while you get a tidbit like that. And in the archaeological record in other places, I'm working on now runaway slave communities in different places because I started in Florida, but I'm going everywhere. And sometimes we find examples of those things in archaeology that we wouldn't find so much in written record. Yes, sir?
You mentioned Mepiano, and I was wondering what you think of the controversy over Mepiano's heritage, whether, he's...
Yeah. I actually have heard Vince Coretta and Paul Lovejoy fight it out at the AHA. I don't know if any of you were present. But I have to admit, I was swayed by Paul, probably. I do believe he was African. These records vary so much when people, put themselves in records. They can say almost anything about themselves. And so I think I was swayed to that position. Do you have one? Do you take a side?
The evidence is based on the birth.
Yeah, in South Carolina.
Not the birth certificate, but when he was baptized.
Uh-huh.
And that's 7 years after when he said it was born.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm inclined to think that
He's South Carolina born?
no, he's African.
That's what I was thinking too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I was convinced, but I have no inside knowledge of it. But
Interesting debate.
yeah, it is.
Because, and I was thinking about you're going to all these archives and having to make judgments about authenticity.
Mm-hmm.
I thought you might have insight into it.
No, I'm sorry, I don't on that one. But I certainly know that the things, for instance, this Francisco Menendez that was going to be a Corsair and go back and see the king in person. The governor of Florida writes very laudatory records also about his good service in these. There was a huge invasion of Florida by General James Oglethorpe that brought Georgia and Florida troops into Spanish Florida and brought the Royal Navy up from Jamaica in 1740. It was a big, huge, expensive, failed expedition. And my guy was a hero in it, and that's why he's writing for some kind of payback from the Spanish king. And in that case, I have all the official records also that record his service from people who wouldn't have really wanted necessarily to be so favorable to him. So sometimes you get enough to pretty well feel like it's you're on the reality. But sometimes you have to sort of put it all together, and I try to get as many different kinds of evidence as I can, so that it's not just official correspondence. It can be land records, it can be a baptism, it can be an archaeological report, but if you get as many different kinds of evidence as possible and triangulate it all, you come to some, hopefully, something that you can stand on. Mariana? Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering, and in my mind, because I never found a match for that so I was wondering if you think that suggests that there might in fact have been a different approach to open slaves to black families.
I think it's really the situation that Brazil and the Spanish colonies are different, because that was one of the first articles I read about godparentage was Stewart's study, where it was just absolutely never done that blacks and whites mixed in the same baptismal records. And I was seeing it every time I turned a page in the church records. And I even found some cases in which a beloved black member of the family served as a godparent for a white child, which you'd never find in Brazil. And I think it was possible, I mean, my own guess is that Brazilians, or the Portuguese in Brazil, felt so overwhelmed by the huge numbers of Africans and the small numbers of Portuguese that they really had to keep that barrier pretty tight, I think. I mean, that's just my guess, but I find it in the Spanish areas very, very, very common. Everywhere else I look in Spanish areas, and I've worked in Mexico, Ecuador, Colombia, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, it's common. Yeah. If those of you who may not know, there was a famous old book in 1946 by Frank Tannenbaum, Slave and Citizen, was the first one to make a comparison between Spanish systems of slavery and Anglo systems, and he makes the big point that the church and the law are the two differences that allow Spanish areas to be more fluid in terms of race relations and allow more people to become free, manumission to occur much more regularly. And to my horror, I find that I represent the Tannenbaum thesis, which is now so old that, I shouldn't be identified with it, I guess. But I make the point that in urban areas, when the Spanish are threatened on a frontier with huge Indian nations to the interior and a coastline they can't defend, and Anglos are always after them, it makes perfect sense, And it wouldn't be the same in the heart of Mexico City or in Lima, where it's a viceroyal capital with lots of arms and more whites and less blacks and less Indians. Then you can afford to be, hierarchical and racist maybe, but in the frontiers you need every person you can count on. So I think that may be a Brazilian-Spanish difference. Yes, sir.
And, maybe to follow up on that, I, as a fellow Harrietianist, I consider you that.
Thank you.
This speaks to the heart of mestizaje, which is what we are proudly accept as being Spanish America. And Spanish America equals mestizaje, transculturación, transculturation, as Fernando Ortiz would point it, or Alejo Carpentier would glorify that word in the kingdom of this world.
Yeah.
So I thank you so much for that excellent piece of scholarship.
Thank you. I'll just say that it was very common for even Anglos and Scots and everybody else that came into this colony to end up having mixed-race children whom they left property to and married off to fine families and that kind of thing. my richest Spanish planter has 9 plantations, had a big free black family first, then a white South Carolina family, and they all serve as godparents for each other, which was really shocking that the South Carolina born or, descended people were so open to being, and they knew each other and they served for godparents for each other's children. It was interesting. You wouldn't find that elsewhere. I'm sorry, yes?
Go back to the point about the retentions, the African
Mm-hmm.
Is there any evidence of the foods that they ate or linguistic systems used
Mm-hmm.
that possibly you've been able to point to in your research that would suggest that some African retentions were retained?
Certainly in Cuba and Brazil too, as Mariana knows, but in Cuba, especially because, again, the rapid influx of Africans in the 1830s and 40s meant that there's a constant reintroduction of African languages, African cultural ideas, and religious ideas, and and in Cuba, they were not afraid of allowing that to happen. They would welcome you into the church, but they also had what they called cabildos de nación, which were like drumming musical groups in the street on ethnic lines. So you'd have the Congo Cabildo, Mandingo Cabildo, and you could have processions on the Day of the Kings, which is Epiphany, everybody dressed in their African outfits with African music, singing African songs, African kings and queens elected, and the Cubans knew it happened. Everybody's out there in the streets partying together. So in certain areas it was, very, very common. And now people from Nigeria come to Cuba and hear the same songs in religious processions that they sing in Nigeria. So it's pretty authentic in certain areas.
Major funding for the George Washington Forum is provided by the Charles G. Koch Charitable Foundation, the Apgar Foundation, the Veritas Fund for Higher Education Reform, and the Thomas W. Smith Foundation. For more information, please visit us on the web at www.ohio.edu/Washington Forum. Thank you.